Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining the South Coast Conservation Program as we explore species at risk baselines. I am your host, Christine Cooper, the Conservation Planner with the South Coast Conservation Program, and I will be moderating this session along with Pamela Zevitt, the SCCP Special Projects Coordinator.
Good morning, everyone.
I'll just review the agenda quickly. I will be giving a welcome and introduction to introduce the South Coast Conservation Program, followed by Stephen Godwin, who will go over his experience working with the City of Surrey, including the adoption of some new policies that can help species at risk, followed by Scott Barrett, who will introduce the stewardship baseline approach and how this tool can be used by local governments protecting species at risk. This will be followed by a discussion and question-answer period. As a participant, your mic is muted, but if you would like to ask a question, please write it in the chat box and we will answer as many as we can after the presentation. We will be recording the webinar and we'll post it on our website at sccp.ca. The South Coast Conservation Program is a multi-partner collaborative which facilitates the protection and recovery of endangered species and ecological communities on BC's South Coast. We have been working on an initiative with local governments to increase capacity to deal with issues in land use planning concerning species and ecosystems at risk. During the first webinar, we explored species and ecosystems at risk within the context of policy recovery and land use management. We heard provincial, federal, and legal perspectives with over 100 registrants and over 75 people that participated. I am happy to be hosting the second webinar, Species at Risk Baselines, which serves as an extension of the knowledge and capacity building for species and ecosystems at risk. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Stephen Godwin, who is a registered professional biologist that has been working to advance environmental initiatives as the Environment Manager for the City of Surrey. He will share experiences and perspectives working on species at risk protection within the City of Surrey, including the new adoption of the Sensitive Ecosystem Development Permit Area Guidelines and Streamside Protection Zoning Bylaws, which change the way projects are developed within Surrey. He will also talk about City of Surrey's experience with protection for species such as the Pacific Water Shrew.
Hope it's all good to go.
We're good to go.
Okay, great. Okay, well, welcome, and I'm going to give you a bit of Surrey's perspective with not only species at risk, but as well as just biodiversity and ecosystems at risk as well. Some of the local government people that are on this webinar will have seen some of these slides before, so I apologize on duplicating, but I'm just trying to get the message out there on what the City of Surrey has done and what worked for us, and maybe some of you can get some insights and see if some of these things and these tools are transferable to other local governments or other community initiatives. Basically, I'll give you sort of a City of Surrey context, and then kind of the why, what, where, and how the City of Surrey has chosen to manage for biodiversity and species at risk, as well as hopefully providing some examples of how we did it here and what it looks like on the ground. Basically, for those who are unfamiliar with Surrey, it's in the Lower Mainland, one of the more southernmost municipalities. We have a lot of development occurring here. We have a lot of brownfield sites and greenfield sites that are being developed. We have a lot of native vegetation and habitats that are still thriving here. However, it's sort of under some threats due to development. Essentially, in Surrey, we obviously have a lot of biodiversity, and a lot of these things are at risk over time as growth occurs. Within the city, we are accruing about 1,000 new residents a month, and it's been on that projection for about the last 10 to 15 years. We're sitting at about 500,000 people right now, if you believe the latest census that we have. So what I'll talk about here is, you know, in Surrey's perspective, a lot of this can be coined under natural capital, things like that, but there's a lot of values and liabilities associated with green infrastructure or riparian areas. So I'll just go over a bunch of examples of these, and from Surrey's perspective, just so you can kind of sort of gain an insight as to it's more than just species at risk or ecosystems, but there's a lot of other community values that are associated with this. With the City of Surrey, we have a natural drainage policy, which basically means that all of our stormwater ultimately ends up within the natural environment down our creek systems. This was done because we have creeks all over the city to start with, but it's also cheaper to put your stormwater into creeks than it is to create pipes and have it to the endpoint in the ocean. So because of our open drainage, natural drainage policy, we have some liabilities associated with maintaining the conveyance of that water as it goes down to the system. Obviously, part of these creek areas, we deal with erosion. Erosion is a natural process. From a biodiversity side of things, it accrues gravel in these streams, which are then used for spawning beds for salmon and benthic habitat, substrate like that. However, managing our storm water is a big deal so that we don't accrue excessive erosion in these areas. We need to have wide enough riparian protection such that these natural processes of erosion can occur. Other things with erosion is typically in our soil types here in the Surrey, the actual, the stable angle of repose is about 2 to 1 or so. When you get erosion at the toe of the slope due to creek erosion, that steepens up that angle of repose, so you start having slope stability. You can get whole slope failure, or you can also get tree failure coming down from that as well. We also get undermining of trees, just physically undermining the root system, so then the trees can collapse onto buildings. That's sort of a big issue. Ultimately, if we have wide riparian areas, then these natural processes can occur without us having to run in there and do some hazard tree abatement. As part of our natural drainage policy, we have to maintain the safe conveyance of water through our systems. So this requires maintenance over time. And different local governments, depending on the type of water courses, they're very familiar with this sort of procedure. What we try to do is we try to allow enough setback from our water courses that our maintenance crews can have safe access to any work site that they need to along these water courses. Typically, this is access beyond top of bank and on geotechnically sound ground. So we need enough setback from top of bank to allow equipment and crews to get in there should they need to at some future point. It doesn't have to be a road like that lower right photo showing. It basically just needs to be able to have solid ground that we can get access to crews out there. Hazard tree management, this is a big deal from our riparian areas or green spaces. We have very large trees in the lower mainland. They grow anywhere between 30 and 55 meters tall. If we were to establish setbacks only to riparian area regs, if it's a Class B ditch, it would be a 2-meter setback, or a fish-bearing ditch would be between a 5 and a 10-meter setback. So if you have a 40-meter tall tree, that one tree growing on one side of the green belt could fail and strike houses across the green belt on the far side. So if you have wider riparian areas, you can manage our native trees a lot better. Encroachments, this is a big deal for local governments. When we have setbacks that are considered relatively insignificant, then the local landowners tend to make the greenbelt landscaping consistent with their own. So they take down their rear yard fences and they start encroaching within the green space. So the wider the green space is, the more ability local governments can place trails within those areas to further legitimate the use, and then it reduces on the propensity of local people to encroach upon. That lower right photo, that entire treehouse structure is all on parkland, and if somebody hurts themselves in that structure, then the landowner usually bears the responsibility of it, so it becomes a parks problem. So it's a huge issue. Invasive plants, obviously the wider a riparian area, the more resilient it is to maintain its own ecotype. This almost speaks for itself, I think. Beavers, and this is sort of often overlooked. They're endemic, they're native in this area, and they're also compulsive in their nature to want to dam streams no matter what. Beaver can set up shop in any of these water courses and raise the water table 1 meter in 24 hours. So if we have narrow setbacks based just on riparian area regs, and those setbacks are taken from the high water mark. That high water mark is when it was measured by the QEP. If a beaver then sets up shop and raises it by 1 meter, obviously things get flooded. So we need to have setbacks wide enough that will allow beavers to do what they do, so we're not running in there and having to remove the beaver dams. Beavers also raise the local water table, and that can be an issue 2 ways. Beavers, they chew down trees, that's what they eat. So if you have a wide riparian area, they can absorb the beavers doing their tree work without striking targets. Raising the water table also causes tree roots over time to knuckle over, and then you get root plate failures, like the bottom right photo there shows that. You also see in the top left photo, that would be an RER setback. So that's probably, that one there is probably about a 7 meter setback from the high water mark, and you can see that doesn't really work well when you get beavers in that area. Trails and public access under RER, we can't place public trails in there. So if we only establish setbacks from creek areas that follow the RER, then it sort of limits the ability that riparian area can become an asset, a community asset for the future. So if we want to place trails in this, we need setbacks wide enough and large enough to be able to position trails into them. Obviously, what this is all about, wildlife move along riparian areas, as well as other areas within our city under our biodiversity conservation strategy. Obviously, the wider these riparian areas are, or green belts, the more resilient they are to maintain their ecosystem status, as well as different wildlife obviously have different reactions to urbanization. So the wider they are, the more robust they are, and they can accommodate a wider breadth of biodiversity to be using them. So as it turns out, in Surrey's perspective, the majority of our species at risk right now tend to be riparian related. If we have robust setbacks around our riparian areas, a lot of the needs and wants of these critical habitats will be managed within the riparian setback areas. As you're all aware, Environment Canada is really rolling out a lot of these management plans, as well as defining some critical habitats. So I'll speak a little later on about the Pacific Water Shrew and Surrey's perspective of how we dealt with this. The lower right photo there, those are actual Pacific Water Shrew critical habitats in Surrey. And when we did an existing lot of record count underneath these critical habitats, we have in the order of about 600 existing lots of record that fall within the defined critical habitat areas. So I'll sort of get into issues that come up with that. The City of Surrey has a biodiversity conservation strategy, and in a nutshell, we basically designated a green infrastructure network, which is hub sites and corridors that are laced throughout the city, all connected. And that is what the city wants to manage for biodiversity through the build out of our city. So as development is occurring, it's chewing away at what is existing green habitat now. And ultimately, the end, we're going to have a connected park system that's going to manage for the biodiversity in our city. When we designed this, we wanted to pick up as much of the constrained and encumbered lands as possible, as well as existing parkland. But at the end of the day, right now, we have about 3,000 acres that are identified within our green infrastructure network that need to be acquired over time through the build out of the city. So this could be over the next 60 years or something like that. About 2/3 of that, we believe we can pick up through our regular land use planning, but that leaves about 1,000 acres or so of privately held land that is outside of the provisions provided to us by the Local Government Act or Community Charter to acquire. So we'll have to develop some sort of financial strategy to purchase these lands over time. With the setbacks that we've established most recently around our creeks, we believe we can acquire about 400 acres of riparian area to accomplish our green infrastructure network. So the RER, I've been alluding to it for a while now. It just manages for fish and fish alone, and there's some arguments as to how well that actually manages for fish. but local governments that are just managing for that may not be also picking up other values and liabilities that the local governments cover. So for Surrey, it was becoming an issue when we're just managing for under RAR. So all of this in a nutshell rolled up that when we had development applications coming to the city, they were unable to understand all of the environmental things and encumbrances that their property or applications may involve. So they would come to the city and expect it's just going to be RER. However, we'd have to, and beavers would be in there. We have tree protection, park trails, erosion, slope stability, things like that. So council gave staff direction to develop some OCP and zoning bylaw changes so that we could incorporate some development permit areas. So basically we embarked upon developing sensitive ecosystem development permit areas as well as amending our zoning bylaw for some streamside protection. So basically what we did is we developed some streamside development permit areas, and what that is the authority came from the Local Government Act, and that specifies environmental protection and provides details of how that protection will take place. Our sensitive ecosystem development permit areas were originally identified in our OCP as a placemaker in 2014, and then we just recently amended the OCP to include these development permit areas. We have divided these sensitive ecosystem DPs into two types. One is considered the green infrastructure, and the other one is considered the streamside protection area. There's some exemptions with these DP areas. Some of them would be farm activities within ALR lands, internal renovations, municipal works, things like that. So for the green infrastructure, I'll focus on that one first. The trigger for this is the Green Infrastructure Network as identified under the Biodiversity Conservation Strategy. The Biodiversity Conservation Strategy, or BCS, is a document that identifies the city-specific ecosystem values and biological assets. So basically, every hub site and corridor is labeled, and it provides management objectives in association with it. What we have done to flag the properties is any property that falls within 50 meters of our green infrastructure network falls within our DP area. Like I said, the provisions of the DP are defined using information within the BCS itself, but essentially the applicant would hire a QEP to regard our BCS document and look at opportunities through which their application can meet the objectives of the BCS, and they would roll that up in what we're considering and calling an ecosystem development plan. This information will be reviewed along with other site conditions, and they would need to show on their application the protection area that clearly defined in the DP application as the green infrastructure protection area. So this is how we're meeting some of the needs of our green infrastructure areas, and this will overlap with a lot of protections required for species at risk. The other DP in our sensitive ecosystem development permit areas is our stream side, and the Surrey stream classification system is a determining factor which triggers which properties require a DP. So if a property falls within 50 meters of the top of bank of one of our Class A's, AO's, or Class B watercourses, then it's the trigger for the streamside DP. What we have done, and we had this advice through internal and external legal, is to place these setbacks within our zoning bylaw. Similar to the green infrastructure, they would need to develop an ecosystem development plan that would be specific to the Streamside area. So the Streamside zoning bylaw is basically a 2-page section that was amended into our zoning bylaw. And this establishes setbacks from our creeks from the top of bank, dependent on the classification of the watercourse, whether it's fish-bearing or non-fish bearing, but considered fisheries like a food nutrient, Class B. So those are the 2 columns, Class A or Class B. And it's also broken down by the stream type that of what it is. So there's channelized, ditches, natural, and large ravines. You know, we had Diamond Head Consulting help the city of Surrey develop this, and it seemed to be that all of our watercourses were best described in this manner. Each local government may have different type of watercourses, but in Surrey we have a lot of channelized streams, ditches, as well as large ravines and natural things. So it seemed like a good way to break these things down. As you can see, there's 2 tables. The top table is in reference to subdivision and rezoning applications. So these would be your classic big 10-acre parcels that are being subdivided into single-family, 20 or 40 lots, things like that. The lower table is for existing lots of record for existing single-family dwellings. So this table would be for somebody who has an existing lot of record, single-family, and they want to build a house on it, or they have an existing house right now and they want to crush it and rebuild a new one. The reason why we have the 2 tables is because previously Surrey followed DFO's land development guidelines, and those were 15 and 30 meters from top of bank dependent on density of development. So in the past for single family homes it was a 15 meter from top of bank. So we didn't want to impose a new zoning bylaw that would require development variance permits and all this existing single lots of record that we have. So we're having them follow essentially the old rules, and we will get more robust setbacks over time when those single family lots get accrued together through a development proposal and they go into a higher density that would require subdivision and rezoning. With this, we have a flex option, and this flex option allows the setback to be varied by either 5 or 3 meters as long as there's no net loss in the total protected area. And this is sort of a pragmatic approach such that you can massage development in and around a setback line. So if an applicant says, hey, this isn't going to work for me, then they would require a development variance permit. Those get reviewed by council, and essentially they would have to regard all the things, all the values and liabilities that the city has associated with these riparian areas to ensure that our values and liabilities are being met through the reduction of their setbacks. So, you know, they'd have to go through, they'd have to retain a QEP to do a detailed RER assessment to make sure it's RER compliant. They'd have to prove out flooding risk, do geotech, assure that there's drainage maintenance access for the municipal staff. They'd have to document the habitat impacts, document any critical habitat, how beavers may affect the site. All these sort of things get assessed. And that would support their development variance permit, at which council makes a decision. So I'm just going to roll through some examples of this stuff very quickly. This slide here is basically showing a single existing lot of record. This is the lower table, the table 2. This just shows that the setback is 15 meters for these. If we had imposed the 30-meter setback, it would put a lot of existing houses into nonconformity. Here's another one when it comes to single-family development in association to a riparian. If they want to do a renovation or extension, much like RER, they do all those renovations away from the watercourse so that the new construction would be compliant with our zoning setbacks. Now, when it comes to subdivision with green infrastructure protection, basically the left-hand portion of this slide, it shows what the parent site looks like. This might be a 2-acre residential area. We've identified a green infrastructure corridor to the northern portion of this. Through the subdivision application, they put together an ecosystem development plan that would look at the objectives of the BCS to ensure they were being met. In this case here, when they split it up into a bunch of RF lots, they would further subdivide the portion that's considered the green infrastructure network, and they would convey that to the city. That's our preference as conveyance. We can never make that a requirement of the development, but in my experience, a lot of the times when it comes to subdivisions like this, the city is able to get these lands as long as the developer can get the lot yield that they're looking for. When it comes to streamside protection area, very similar. Left-hand portion of the slide shows the parent lot with a creek on it. Through the zoning bylaw, because this lot is within 50 meters top of bank, obviously the DP is flagged. Through their subdivision application, they would look at the zoning table to determine what the appropriate setback is. So in this case here, this setback is shown where the riparian area is. That land preferentially would be conveyed to the city, and then the developer gets their lot yield through their RF lots. Sometimes we have a combination of many DPs. We have, in this case, we have both green infrastructure and streamside. There could also be a hazard DP as well. There's only one DP application, but many objectives need to be met. So in this case here, the parent lot is on the left, showing that there's a stream at the north portion with the Biodiversity Conservation Strategy hub on the side. The zoning setback would establish the setback along the northern property line, along the eastern property line there. As long as the BCF objectives are being met, some of those wildlife passage can be done on private land. So I'm trying to demonstrate through this slide that there's an ability not only to either convey the land to the city or to have protection measures put on place on their lot. That could be through landscaping and whatnot to meet the objectives of the BCS. So what does this look like in real life? Here's one. This is South Surrey. This was a subdivision done probably 15 years ago. Wills Brook passes through the middle, and the choice of this subdivision plan was to place restricted covenants along the back edge of all those lots. So I would not necessarily say this was a success, but the developer at the time needed to get lot depth to be able to get the size houses they needed. So the conveyance of the riparian area wasn't preferred, so they went with a restricted covenant on it. Restricted covenants have their challenges simply because to enforce them you need a court order. So it's difficult. We have challenges with this. It's not ideal. The other way is through conveyance. So you can see this used to be single-family development. It went in for higher density. These are townhouses. The green signifies the parkland, and you can see kind of on the right-hand bias there's a large single-family lot. And when that comes forward for a development application, the zoning bylaw will determine what the setback is, and then as they push for higher density like townhouses, you can see that there is a road access coming through from the subdivision through the townhouses butting up against a single-family lot. When they come forward with a development application to put more townhouses in to gain access through the subdivision to the west there, we will get that land conveyed to the city as parkland. Here's an example of the GIN. To the left is what the desire line of the green infrastructure network is. So that's a corridor that goes along. We typically center these on property line to share the burden of the green infrastructure network on both properties. But you can see on the right-hand photo there, that's ultimately what we got through the development or the application on this site. So they conveyed those lands that constitute the green infrastructure network on the sort of western side of their industrial lot, and away they go. So I'm kind of switching in the species at risk here. You're all familiar that this is part of the federal legislation. They've just been coming out with a bunch of guidance documents and policy documents that they're looking for people to critique on. I think on November 18th is the date they're trying to get some information back on. But essentially, they're coming out with policy on critical habitat protection on non-federal lands. I think it's pretty well ironed out how species at risk are how to be managed on federal lands, but as it comes down from the provincial, and Scott can maybe address this a little bit more in his discussion, when it comes down to private land, it's a little bit more nebulous at this point, with words such as effective protection, which needs to be fully defined better, and I think they're trying to do that with their policy statements. So in a nutshell, City of Surrey has a bunch of Pacific Water Shrew critical habitat polygons, and most recently we had some development applications happening on ALR land. They were former Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure lands. They were considered surplus due to not needing them for Highway 10 widening, so they sold it off privately. So they sold these lands to private people, and those private people came into the city for driveway access and building permits. Right away it was flagged because this is in designated critical habitat, and we were unsure of how to proceed with this. So with discussions with Environment Canada and the province, it seemed best that qualified environmental professionals were retained. For this case, they looked at the habitat rating on site from nil, low, moderate, or high value critical habitat. Those were mapped out on site. Then they placed what the QEP felt were best recommendations to demonstrate effective protection. And like I say, effective protection, it has yet to be fully defined with the terms of reference as to exactly what that is. There's a lot of sort of judgment call and gray areas on exactly what effective protection is. But the QEPs did their best estimate of that using the guidance documents that are available to them. And in this case here, what was settled down on was the riparian area reg setbacks were employed along the watercourses that were there. This site, it's basically a canary grass wasteland, so the amount of actual critical habitat functions and features for the Pacific Water Shrew are pretty limited. So they felt with protecting the riparian areas to the riparian area reg setbacks, fencing them, and then allowing development to occur on the remainder of the lot would be considered effective protection at this time. So there are some issues with this. Ultimately, with these rare and endangered species, there's very few biologists, let's say, that would be considered qualified environmental professionals for that specific animal or organism or plant. So sourcing QEPs for specific creatures at this time is limited. And also at the end of the day, it's undetermined as to when the QEP writes an effective protection plan or effective management plan, who endorses this, who signs it off, or are we just sticking with a QEP signing it off and writing their stamp in on it? So for Surrey's perspective, that's what we chose to do. The QEPs wrote recommendations on what they believed was the best approach to demonstrating effective protection. We then appended that QEP report to any permit that the city lets out. So in one of them, it was a driveway permit. The other one was a building permit for a residential house. We appended the report to the permit, and then we made the recommendations of the report conditions of the permit. So if the recommendation was to fence the area and the applicant ended up not fencing it, we were able to place a stop work order on the building permit because putting the fence up was a recommendation of the report, which was a condition of the permit. So that allowed us to have some strength on enforcing the provisions and recommendations of the report. When it comes to, I'll briefly go over the eagles and herons. We have eagles and herons in the city of Surrey. They're protected under Section 34 of the Provincial Wildlife Act, and we followed a QEP model with this. We had some great negotiations with the province on this to come up with a pathway through which development could continue to occur, using the guidance of qualified environmental professionals. So essentially, we follow in the city of Surrey, if there's an application that falls within one of these setback areas from an eagle nest, then the applicant is retained a QEP to look at the guidance documents that the province has placed out there. So those are the urban developments, trying to think of the name of them here. That's the provincial best management practices for raptor conservation during urban and rural development, and then they have some guideline fact sheets for bald eagles and osprey, as well as great blue herons. So those are broken down into 8 BMP strategies, and the QEP looks at how the development will manage for that. In the city of Surrey, we have about 44 known eagle nests. We get them inventoried every year, and then we place buffer rings on them to following the urban land designations, and those are flagged for development underneath it. So when the development occurs or petitions to occur within that, they would have to retain a QEP to develop an eagle nest management plan following their terms of reference, which basically says, look at the 8 best management practices that the province puts out. Let us know which of those 8 best management practices that you're following, which ones you're choosing not to follow, and how, in your professional opinion, if your recommendations are followed, that it will not end up with a contravention of the Wildlife Act. They do that, and development keeps moving forward. So here's an example of where the rubber hit the road. The left-hand photo shows the eagle nest with the internal ring. The yellow ring is the vegetated buffer, and the blue ring is the noise buffer while the bird nest is active with young. In this case, a subdivision was planted right over top of it. QEPs were employed to develop an eagle nest management plan, and in this case here, they had to ensure that when they were removing vegetation, to punch in 156A Street, as well as to clear the lots around the nest site. They had to take into consideration wind throw for the eagle nest. That was all good, and they prescribed that all into the nest management plan. Also, as part of that nest management plan, was to place a no-build RC on those 3 lots that those arrows point to. And that no-build RC basically is in place until that eagle nest no longer occurs. So it's in a cottonwood tree. So the day that that cottonwood tree blows up and the biologist says, yes, this nest is on the ground, it's no longer functioning as a nest site, that RC can be lifted off of those lots, and then the developer would be able to complete those lots. So until such time, the neighborhood has a bald eagle nest in it with constrained lots. So that's essentially how the city's been dealing with this stuff. So I'm just wrapping it up here. If you have any questions or comments offline that we can't manage through this webinar, then feel free to contact me. A lot of this information for our sensitive ecosystem development permit areas are on the City of Surrey website under our official community plan flag. So I hope that addresses all the things you need to hear from me. Thank you.